Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today for this webinar on teaching perspective taking and executive function skills to children with autism. If you signed up for the CEs for this event, please be signed on to your IM using the instructions that were sent to you and make sure you're participating throughout in a roll call fashion. So I'm Angela Persicke, and I am a board-certified behavior analyst, and I am a research and development supervisor at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, as well as the assistant director at Autism Research Group. Let's go ahead and get started with our presentation today. So to give you a brief overview and an outline for this talk, I will begin by discussing cognition and how it involves behavior. And as most of us already know, behavior is teachable. Executive functions and perspective taking refer to socially critical repertoires of behavior, and ABA can be used to teach all of these. I will then go into examples of research and clinical data in support of these. So, as I may be preaching to the choir here, but as most of us probably know, hundreds of studies have demonstrated the effectiveness of applied behavior analytic treatment for autism. And so specifically, early intensive behavior intervention programs attempt to teach the child everything they need to learn, starting with most basic skills such as attending or orienting to different stimuli in the environment or joint attention, all the way through these complex social and cognitive skills such as perspective taking. Again, this may be very familiar to all of you who are listening today, but a common myth of ABA is that we are just a robot factory and creating little robots. But this is not true. ABA actually teaches genuine concepts and true understanding. So behavior analysis is a general science and is equally applicable to simple and complex behaviors. However, the ABA research literature on autism treatment has a heavy emphasis on teaching relatively simple repertoires of behavior, as well as decreasing severe behaviors. And these are foundational and very important, but more research is needed if we want a comprehensive science of human behavior and science to tell us how to teach complex repertoires to children with autism who don't actually have these skills. So research continues to focus on simple behavior because it's easier to demonstrate a clear functional relation. And demonstrating clear functional relationships is richly reinforced in research. If you pick up any behavioral journal, you will see many examples of publications showing clear functional relationships. And a lot of the time, these are focused on teaching simple repertoires of behavior or reducing problem behavior. But researching complex behavior will result in less pretty data, as we may say. It's a little messier because it is more complex and possibly a lower rate of publications. With that being said, a few years ago, the R&D department at CARD decided to do it anyways and accept the lower rate of publication and possibly the less than ideal data. So this talk describes our first clumsy steps in teaching cognitive skills to children with autism. Radical behaviorism is the theoretical framework that ABA is based in, and Skinner discusses the importance of including private events in our scientific analysis in many of his works. He suggests that behavior analysis is a comprehensive science of behavior. And if a person is doing something, anything, no matter what it is, this is a part of the subject matter of behavior analysis and is appropriate for scientific investigation. So private events can't be directly observed by others, but they still exist and they are part of our science. So we should find a way to investigate them and systematically do this through our evaluation. So you may be asking yourself right now, isn't using ABA to address cognition a slippery slope? Are we getting into something that will make us look more like a cognitive science or a developmental science? Well, here's a way to avoid mentalism. First, we never ascribe the cause of behavior to an invented, unobservable mechanism. We don't say that the cause of behavior is within the skin. We always ascribe the cause of behavior to the organism's learning history and current environment. So our basic approach looks like this. We will start by identifying the SDs, discriminative stimuli, establishing operations, rules, behaviors, and consequences that may be maintaining these cognitive events or cognitive skill sets. Then we identify the generalized operant defined by these variables. And then we want to ask ourselves, is the analysis complete without including any private events? If the answer is yes, we will start planning and teaching the skill to the child. If no, then we will repeat this analysis and the process above to include private antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Then at the end of this, we want to throw out the traditional hypothetical mechanisms away completely out of our process. So how we design and execute these procedures is through 3 fairly simple steps. First, we will test the cognitive skill in baseline. So we want to see if the child is demonstrating the skill at all. And we do this in baseline without any prompting or feedback or any differential consequences. Then we will teach the skill. The most effective method for teaching generalized operants is multiple exemplar training. And this is done by providing many learning opportunities. Of course, using prompting, reinforcement, and prompt fading. And you want to remember no rote learning. We will include many exemplars, which is the essence of multiple exemplar training. We are providing the child with many different opportunities to learn this specific skill set. And we are not teaching the child to respond to specific stimuli. And then we will continue till generalization is observed across novel exemplars. Once that occurs, we will retest the baseline probes or the cognitive skill that we tested in baseline. And this is exactly the same as pre-intervention or the baseline phase. And that you want to remember that the novel exemplars that are included in baseline and the post-test were never included in training. So this is a real test of generalization to novel exemplars. I want you to remember this approach as we move through all of the studies I will be discussing. This is the approach we have used in every single study on complex behavior and cognitive skills. So let's talk about perspective taking a little bit. What does this actually mean? It means that we understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. Or, you know, it's like thinking about what others are thinking about or what they may do, thinking about another's thoughts. This is critical for meaningful social interaction. Just think for a second of how many times you consider another person's thoughts or behaviors when thinking about what you might do. This is exactly what we're talking about. This is also relevant to empathy, sympathy, and altruism. So if you're able to engage in perspective taking, you are able to understand how another person may be feeling in a given moment based on what is happening in their environment. In the developmental and cognitive literature, this is referred to as theory of mind. And if you look this up in PsycInfo, there are over 970 hits by just typing in this phrase. So in other psychological domains, theory of mind is studied throughout, and a lot actually. And the theory of mind literature is virtually all assessment and virtually no treatment. They continually assess the children to see if they are able to engage in these theory of mind behaviors, and find that in most cases children with autism cannot. Very little ABA research has been conducted. There are 2 studies by Charlotte and colleagues that were done in 2003, but these studies primarily targeted teaching the children to respond to a specific theory of mind task, and not necessarily teaching them the generalized ability to engage in perspective taking. So here are some areas of perspective taking that are addressed in the theory of mind literature. You have physical states. So this refers to how a person may be feeling at a given moment. So are they tired? Are they hungry? Emotions, which we're all very much aware of, cause and effect. Sensory perspective taking, which was one of the simpler forms of perspective taking, and we will discuss this specific form in more detail in a few slides. Desires, so what one wants. Preferences, what one prefers at any given moment. Knowing, so how do we know if something's true or something's false, or how do we know what is going on in our environment. Thinking, which of course is our thoughts and private events. Beliefs, so this refers to false beliefs or true beliefs. So why would someone believe something that may not be true? Deception, we will discuss deception in a few slides as well. Intention, so what are people intending to do? And detecting sarcasm. Just glancing at these, they seem like invented explanatory fictions, but these all involve behaviors, and we are able to teach these behaviors. So let's look at simple perspective taking. Our general approach to perspective taking is to name the mentalistic term, then identify likely private events that may be involved, identify overt stimuli that are likely correlated with them, and then teach the child to respond to those overt stimuli in a socially effective way. So, if the overt stimulus is looking at, pointing to, or reaching for something, the likely private events that are correlated with this are the child wants it, sees it, or is thinking about it. Oftentimes, looking at something is highly correlated with thinking about it, that we almost assume that that is just what is going on when someone is looking at something. So if a teacher says, what does she want? What is he thinking about? Or what does he see? And then teaches the child to answer, she wants, sees, is thinking about the object name. This is the simplest form of perspective taking that we may teach. So we're teaching the child to respond to things like eye gaze or a point. And this is the basic component of perspective taking. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So, in the simplest forms of perspective taking, we have an overt discriminative stimulus. So in this case, I listed smiling, reaching, or looking at something. And these may be discriminative for a variety of different overt perspective taking responses, depending on what conditional stimulus is present. So for example, if the SD is smiling and the overt conditional stimulus is how does he feel, the child may respond by saying he's happy. So it's worth noting that the behavior by definition cannot actually be attacked. And we may sometimes refer to this as a multiple tact or a part tact or an interverbal. But it's not a pure tact because we cannot tact the person's private events. So the probability that the perspective taking response is actually accurate depends on the frequency with which the overt stimulus actually occurs at the same time that the private event occurs. And this is what the perspective taker actually is inferring. So here is an example of sensory perspective taking. This study was published by Gould and colleagues in 2011, and they taught a simple basic component skill of perspective taking, which was teaching children with autism to identify what others see based on orientation of eye gaze. So here's an example of what this looked like. They had 5 pictures available. The middle picture had a person looking towards one of the objects in different locations. And in this example, the child would be asked, what does he see? And the child would be taught to respond, the dog. And arrows would sometimes be placed from the person's eyes toward the picture they were looking at to help prompt the child to determine what the person sees. In that last form of perspective taking, we're looking at a very, very simple basic component, and just by saying that what a person sees may be what they're thinking about, as I described earlier. This can go into more advanced sensory perspective taking, specifically by teaching the child to determine what he sees versus what someone else sees. So for example, you would have two people see different things and ask the child, so what do you see? What does the other person see? Why can't you see what he sees? And so on. You can do this with other senses too, hearing, touch, taste, etc. And this is pretty much teaching the child to identify that what they see and their perspective may be different from everyone else's. In complex perspective taking, these repertoires begin to come together. So many perspective taking episodes expand on the basic model that I just described. This requires identifying relations between multiple environmental variables and others' private events. These perspective-taking behaviors are far more complex and likely involve complex networks of derived relational responding. Relational frame theory is useful in describing how these may be learned, but that is beyond the scope of this presentation. I will not discuss it here. Emotional cause and effect is an example of complex perspective taking. And in this case, you're looking at one inferring causal relations between overt events and what emotions they are likely to cause in others. So many of these occur in conventional frames. So if one is denied a desire, this may cause negative emotions. So if Julie drops her ice cream cone, then she will be sad. Or a satisfied desire causes a positive emotion. Jimmy's favorite food is French fries. We are having French fries for lunch, so he is going to be happy. This may seem so basic to all of us who are used to learning about or used to engaging in this behavior on a daily basis. But for an individual with autism who may be deficit in this area, this is not that obvious that Julie would be sad if she dropped her ice cream cone. So we have to teach the child to engage in the behaviors that are required to determine how a person will feel if they are denied a desire, or if their desire is satisfied. Now I will discuss some specific research that has been conducted through the lab and the R&D department at CARD. I will go into detail on a lot of these studies, but I want you to keep in mind that the basic procedure that I mentioned earlier, where we test the skill, then we train, and then we retest the skill, is pretty much what we use in all of these studies. So let's start with sarcasm. As I mentioned earlier, detecting sarcasm is part of perspective taking. It refers to saying the opposite of what you actually mean. So if it's a really nice day outside and I really want to go for a walk, I might say something like, oh, the weather's awful. I would hate to go for a walk. And this actually means that I really do want to go outside. And a lot of people will be able to pick up on my sarcasm and be able to respond appropriately by saying, okay, let's go for a walk, or that's a good idea, let's go outside, instead of saying, no, it's a great day outside, why wouldn't you want to go for a walk? It's very frequent in conversation, and it's estimated up to about 8% of exchanges involve sarcastic comments. Individuals with autism, though, have documented deficits in comprehending and using sarcasm. But little or no previous research on teaching sarcasm comprehension has been done, especially in the ABA research. So we recently published a study in Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders where we taught children with autism to detect and respond appropriately to sarcastic statements. Again, we used multiple exemplar training because we were teaching a generalized operant. We were teaching the child to respond to sarcasm in general and not just specific instances of sarcastic comments. We also taught the kids with autism to discriminate between sarcastic and sincere comments. The way we structured this was that we conducted sessions during natural play or natural conversation with the client, and we talked about numerous topics, and then we inserted sarcastic comments at irregular intervals, so the child had no idea when a sarcastic comment or a sincere comment was going to be stated. We also provided the client with a rule in this case. So we said, sometimes people say the opposite of what they really mean, and this means they are being sarcastic. So when someone's being sarcastic, they're probably trying to be funny, and so you should laugh or smile. We also gave specific feedback to clients based on their responses to sarcastic comments. So here's an example of one of the child's data from the study. We included 3 children in the study, so this was in a multiple baseline design. Again, note how we first started with baseline and probes, and then went to training and then post-training to retest the probes we used in baseline. For this child specifically, in baseline, he was responding with 0% accuracy to all sarcastic comments. So he may have said things like, if I were to say, oh, the weather is awful outside, I definitely don't want to go for a walk, he would have probably responded literally to that and said, no, it's really nice outside, we should go for a walk. And some of these clients actually were a little angry by our sarcastic comments and responded overly literal in most cases. Then with multiple exemplar training and providing the rule, you see an immediate increase of accuracy to 100%. And these first squares are very discrete contexts. So for here, we were actually showing videos of very discrete contexts where the child had to respond to our sarcastic comment in the presence of the video. Then we went to in vivo training, and as you may notice, the data are not all at 100%. They are not perfect. This was a little more difficult for the children. The stars represent novel exemplars, and this is how we directly tested for generalization, and we continued training until we saw the child responding to these novel exemplars across multiple sessions. Then we went into post-training to test the original exemplars from baseline that were never included in training. And you can see responding was much higher than baseline, above 70%, and with additional novel probes as well, and 1, 2, and 3-month follow-ups. Now let's talk about another area of perspective taking, deception. So unfortunately, humans lie to each other all the time. Sometimes we lie to each other to be polite. So say if grandma gives you these awful socks for Christmas, you're not going to tell her, these socks are awful, grandma, thanks for the really terrible gift. You're going to say, thanks, grandma, that was so sweet of you. This is a lie, but it's a white lie, and it's a lie that doesn't necessarily hurt anybody. It's a lie that is appropriate under certain contexts. But then there are lies to hurt people as well. So people with autism have deficits in lying and detecting lies. And children with autism are often bullied up to 4 times more often than typical children. The inability to detect lies makes these children easy targets and vulnerable to future victimization. If peers in the class realize they can lie to these children to maybe take their belongings or exclude them from activities, and the children just believe the lies, they are very easy targets for future problems like this. So lie detection is perspective taking, because it's discriminating what another person says versus what he actually thinks. So this study we published recently as well, and it was on teaching children with autism to detect and respond to deceptive statements. This is very similar to the study on sarcasm. So as I mentioned, our clients get bullied through lying a lot. So a child may say, the teacher said I can have your toy, and the child will just give it to them. And this is something that parents and clinicians were reporting, that our children were getting bullied and they didn't know how to teach the skills appropriate in these situations. So we used multiple exemplar training to teach 3 children to recognize lies and to resist them. Two kinds of lies were included in the study. Lies to exclude the client, so maybe saying, you're a boy so you can't play, or you have blonde hair so you can't play, or lies to take possessions from the client, as the example I stated above. In baseline and post-training, we provided 4 lies in each session, 2 to exclude and 2 to take the child's possessions. And also we included 1 session with a same age peer to ensure that the child was responding the same way to a peer as he was to the adult therapist. And specifically, we included the peer because this was the behavior we wanted to actually target. We wanted the child to respond to his peers, not just therapists or adults. So the intervention, again, included multiple exemplar training. I think you're starting to see how we're using this procedure over and over. We continued training until generalization was observed across untrained lies and a novel peer. We also did a follow-up. For 1 month, we did a follow-up probe using novel exemplars and, again, no feedback. So here's an example of one of the children's data sets. In baseline, the child was only responding less than 25% of the time to the lies we stated. And I want to have you know that this was not a fun study to do. We had to purposely lie to the children, but we did include these lies in fun play sessions, so we weren't necessarily being mean to the children, but and we did redirect them after a few minutes after responding to the lie. But the children were visibly upset, but they didn't know what to do about it. They really said, oh, okay, I guess I'll just go play by myself. The dark triangle at the bottom of baseline is the peer session. So you can see with this kid, he specifically was not responding to any of the lies that the peer was telling him. With multiple exemplar training, there was an immediate increase, and the generalization probes are the open squares, and you can see that after 2 sessions, the child was responding to the generalization probes at 100% accuracy. Then we brought in another peer that was not included in baseline to test to see if the child would respond the same way he was responding to the therapist with a new peer. And in this case, the child was responding at 100% accuracy, and so we moved to post-training. The 3 circles are the same exemplars from baseline, and you can see he was responding with 100% accuracy, a much better improvement from baseline sessions. And of course, with the peer probe too, this was the same peer that was included in baseline but not in training. He responded with 100% accuracy and at the 1-month follow-up. So we can confidently say here that our procedure is working. Now, metaphors are similar to sarcasm and deception in that it's non-literal language. So metaphors involve calling a thing something other than what it actually is. It is very common in everyday conversation and estimates up to about 4 times per minute we use metaphors. An individual with autism will have deficits in understanding and using metaphors and other forms of non-literal language, as you saw with sarcasm and deception. RFT provides a conceptual analysis of metaphors, but we won't go into much detail here, but we did use the RFT conceptual analysis to design this study. Understanding a novel metaphor requires identifying the shared characteristic of a thing and the metaphor used to describe it. So for example, let's look at a metaphor. Cats are dictators. So when I say this, you may be thinking, okay, well, cats are bossy, they're felines, and they take a lot of naps. And dictators have mustaches, are typically male, and they are bossy too. Oh, they are both bossy. So ergo, the metaphor means that cats are bossy. This is the procedure that we use when teaching children to metaphorical reasoning. And this study, again, was published just this last year, and we were teaching the generalized skill of responding and being able to figure out novel metaphors, not just specific metaphors. So we taught these children to talk themselves through solving the novel metaphor, kind of like I did for the cats are dictators metaphor. And again, we used multiple exemplar training, and for 2 of the children, we used a visual aid to help. Let's look at what this may look like. We used stories that we created with somewhat unfamiliar metaphors. So it wasn't, they weren't metaphors that you would hear every day and that these children may have heard every day, like it's raining cats and dogs. So here's an example. I knew a boy who wore yellow clothes, was strong, and stayed up late. What does it mean when I say the boy is an owl? So as you can see, we can set up this story so that the boy, the target of the metaphor, had a few different features that we stated, but we did not state the features of an owl. At this point, the children, some prerequisite skills that the children had were being able to determine the features of something. So that was already established before starting the study. Then we told the children either to talk through it or use a visual aid, somewhat like you see here, to determine what the metaphor means. So the boy in this story always wears yellow, is strong, and stays up late. So what's the owl like? The owl is awake at night, is a bird, and says hoo-hoo. And then we asked the children to determine the similar feature by drawing a line if they were using the visual aid, or to just talk about it. So how are these alike? What about the boy is like the owl? And so therefore, once they determined a similar feature, we said, oh good, so what does this mean? What does the boy is an owl mean? That means the boy stays up late like an owl. Here are the data for one of the children in this study. Again, this was a multiple baseline across participants study. In baseline, this child specifically was not responding to any of the metaphors accurately. He was very literal as well, and so he would say things like, oh, the chair can't be a cloud. A chair and a cloud are different things. They're not the same. They're not. And so he was, a lot of times they would be a little upset too. So why are you saying that? It's not a cloud. I don't understand. Then we use multiple exemplar training in the way that I mentioned before, and including novel metaphors for each session. These open squares are depict responding to the novel metaphors, and is a directly describes the generalization across novel exemplars. And we continued training until we saw accuracy above 80% across 3 sessions, and then we included an additional probe without any feedback to make sure once reinforcement was removed, the child still be responding correctly. Then we initiated post-training. As you can see here, this is an example of where the data may be a little messier than typical data you would see in, let's say, Java. So here, responding was above 50% across all exemplars, which was a remarkable increase from baseline, but it's not perfect. So we can say that the child did learn to respond to novel metaphors because none of these metaphors were included in the multiple baseline training phase. And we did include novel exemplars in the multiple exemplar training phase as well. But it's not perfect. So this is one of our examples of where this may not be exactly like we want to see. It's not the ideal case, but we can say that the child learned to respond to novel metaphors. So let's talk a little bit about executive functions now. So the traditional definition of executive functions is that the brain functions that control purposeful or goal-directed behavior are executive functions. And these areas may include attention, working memory, self-monitoring, self-control, inhibition, planning, problem-solving, multitasking, and rule acquisition. Most executive functions sound like mentalistic explanatory fictions. You may have looked at that list on the previous slide and say, oh, these are related to explanatory fictions or inner causes. But most of them also involve something a person does. Many refer to important behavioral repertoires. And if a portion of any of these involves behavior analysis should have something to say about it and should include it in their experimental analysis. So Skinner discusses self-control in a number of his works. And executive functions sound often like there's someone deciding what to do, someone inside you deciding what to do. Skinner acknowledged the existence of self-control, but he defined it as this: one can control one's own behavior via the same method as controlling others' behavior. So this is by manipulating the environment in ways that affect the behavior. Think of it if you're going grocery shopping. Oftentimes you will engage in private behavior, think about or rehearse the items that you need or categorize them in a way to yourself that is not overt. This is what Skinner means by manipulating the environment in ways that affect behavior. Rule following is included in executive functions. Rule-governed behavior is a lengthy, complex, and under-researched area of behavior analysis. The ability to follow and/or derive one's own rules is a critical executive function. We define and derive rules for ourselves all the time. These sometimes look like if-then statements, but most of the time it's just contingency specifying stimuli, so telling us what will happen in a given situation. Most previous research has evaluated the properties of rule-governed behavior, but little previous research on establishing rule-governed behavior in individuals who do not do it has been conducted. So specifically, we're talking about children with autism who are not able to engage in these behaviors. So rules are just antecedent descriptions of contingencies that control behavior as if the behavior has contacted the described contingencies, even though it has not. So for example, no one would pick up a bottle that has the label poison on it, despite never having done so in the past. You would not drink the bottle with the poison on it. You don't have to contact this contingency to know that you're not going to do that. Jonathan Tarbox and colleagues published a rule-following study in the analysis of verbal behavior in 2011. And this was teaching a preliminary repertoire of rule following to children with autism. So in this study, they trained children with autism to follow rules that described antecedents and behaviors. The antecedents were picture cards depicting common items, and the behaviors were simple motor responses. So some examples of the cards were like this: if this is a carrot, then clap. If this is a fire engine, then stomp your feet. Or if this is a fork, then touch your nose. They trained multiple exemplars until generalization was observed to untrained exemplars. So some adjustments were required for some of the children, but generalization was obtained for all 6 children in the study. Here is one of the data sets. So you can see accuracy is low, below 50% in baseline. Then with multiple exemplar training, although a little messy, not a clear effect to 100% accuracy across all data points, you can see that training was effective for this child. The open triangles are the generalization rules. So this is when they gave a child a picture that he had never seen and was never in training and asked him to follow a rule when he saw it. So you can see about 50% of the time the child was responding accurately to these rules until about the end of the study, where there were 3 sessions where he was responding with 80% accuracy. Working memory is another area of executive functioning. The traditional approach is that we have this ability to store information online in the short term and process that information on an ongoing basis. So for example, when you hear a random string of words, you are able to repeat it backwards. From the behavioral perspective, nothing is stored, and the organisms are not filing cabinets or hard drives. So whatever you do in response to the information in the environment is something you do. It's behavior. If you do it covertly, then it's private behavior. So we want to teach the generalizability, not rote responding, to particular tasks. So we would start with small, easy tasks of working memory, then teach the self-management repertoire overtly. In this case, it was rehearsal, and prompt the child to emit it covertly. So emit it privately. We would teach across many tasks until generalization to untrained tasks occurred. 3 preliminary studies were conducted on working memory. 6 high-functioning children with autism were included. And we state high-functioning, but it just means that they had the prerequisite skills required for this task. We included 3 working memory tasks and used positive reinforcement for correct responding. So if the child responded correctly to one of these tasks, he would get a minute of time with his iPad or something similar to that. We prompted rehearsal behavior if needed for some, and for some of the children it was needed, and tested maintenance after reinforcement was withdrawn. We then tested generalization to untrained tasks. This was one of the studies that was published on working memory. It used the complex span working memory task, which involves presentation of a series of pictures. And the participant has to answer a classification question regarding the function of the item. So, can you eat it? Yes or no. Can you wear it? Yes or no. After the string of pictures were presented, the participant has to report the item he saw, not the classification question, but the actual item in the picture in the correct order. Here are the data for one of the kids in this study. You can see in baseline the child was responding below 20% for both the training stimuli and the generalization stimuli. With reinforcement alone, there is an increase, but it was not as good as the researchers expected, so they did some modifications and added the verbal prompt of telling the child to rehearse the pictures to himself. You can see that that worked really well, and the child was responding across multiple sessions at 100%. Then they told the child, okay, you can say it aloud, but you have to whisper. Then they told him you can move your lips, but you can't make any sounds. And then finally they said no lip movement at all. You see a little bit of a decrease as the fading occurred across those responses, but then at the end the child's accuracy returned up to 100%. In post-training, they tested the probes from baseline to show that the child did make improvements. It wasn't as good as seen in the training phase previously, but remarkable improvements from baseline levels, suggesting that this was effective. So, let's do a little recap of what we talked about. Perspective taking and executive functions are names for things that people actually do. They are behaviors that the people engage in. And although they may be covert or private events, they are still behaviors. And if you are sitting here, you are probably thinking about this presentation or thinking about things that are going on today. Even though other people can't see that, that is still a behavior you are engaging in. So perspective taking and executive functions occur as the actions of an organism with a learning history in an environmental context. So perspective taking and executive functions are shaped up through the individual's learning history and occur because of environmental context. So of course brain activity is critical, but the brain is critical to everything else we do. So if you are sitting there twiddling your thumbs, there's brain activity. If you're chewing gum or walking, you're engaging in brain activity. We are not saying that brain activity is not important, because it definitely is, and it occurs with everything. But we are saying that this method of looking at these events as behavior makes it so we can evaluate them and teach them. Research on teaching the skills is still in its infancy. As you can see, there are not many people in the field that are actually studying these and publishing on them. Even though many clinicians may actually use these procedures often for their children, there are not a lot of studies being published in this area. But our preliminary results are very encouraging. So from the data so far, you can see that multiple exemplar training to teach generalized operants in this area has been effective over a wide range of perspective taking and executive function skills. So in conclusion, treating perspective taking and executive functions as learned behavior is very practical. It gives us something to actually do about it other than simply describing the deficits. So we can actually find a way to teach or remediate these deficits rather than just saying that a child with autism is incapable of learning it. And in our case, we feel that that is never the case. The child who has these deficits is able to learn these skills. As I mentioned earlier, relational frame theory provides a useful way of talking about cognition as behavior and how that behavior develops in the lifetime of an individual. But a discussion of relational frame theory is available in other presentations and not this one today. Multiple exemplar training until generalization occurs across novel exemplars appears to work in most cases. In our cases, in our presentations, in our research, we have found that this method to be very effective at teaching these skills. We have primarily used this method and haven't explored other methods. So for the most part, this seems to work very well, but there may be other methods out there that are more effective. So a take-home note is don't be afraid of being called mentalistic. If you are manipulating the environment to improve behavior and not explaining behavior with invented fictions, you are doing behavior analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, Skinner wanted to include private events in his conceptual and theoretical framework of behavior analysis. And that behavior analysis should be a comprehensive science of psychology. And that means it should include things like cognition and executive function in its scientific analysis. And that these should be referred to as behavior that the individual engages in. Expanding behavior analysis into cognition will do two very great things. It will help make behavior analysis a more comprehensive science, and it will provide treatments for cognitive deficits that actually work. All of the studies that we have shown, or for the most part, these were treatment evaluation studies. So these were children who had these deficits, and these treatments would have been included in their typical programming lessons. But we evaluated them scientifically, and were able to provide you and the community of ABA in general with the results by publishing them. These children would have needed to learn these behaviors anyways, and so we were able to actually teach them and do something that worked for these children. So this talk is based on the skills curriculum and program development work of many expert clinicians and researchers, including Doreen Graham-Pichet, Evelyn Kung, Carolyn Bredick, Kathy Thompson, Lisa Stoddard, Rachel Leonard, Adele Nadowski, and Evelyn Gold. These studies were also based in the skills curriculum. So every one of these skills and these research studies that we presented were areas that the skills curriculum targets. So the skills curriculum provided us with a basis of what skills we can teach and even the prerequisite skills that may be required for these children. The skills curriculum was very useful for us in actually designing these studies, and it includes ways to teach these skills to children with autism. But all the real research work was done by scientists, practitioners, past and present, including Ryan Bergstrom, Jennifer Rannick, Megan St. Clair, Lisa Boutrichat, Carrie Zuckerman, Megan Maxner, Amy Kenzer, Michelle Bishop, and Melissa Olive. All these scientists practitioners are clinicians and researchers at CARD and Autism Research Group. For more information about Autism Research Group and some of the studies that we are currently conducting, please visit our website at www.autismresearchgroup.org. So that concludes the presentation today on teaching perspective taking and executive function skills to children with autism. I will be able to take questions at this point, so let's see if anybody has any. Did you emphasize discrimination based on context? The statement is obviously untrue, or based on a sarcastic tone of voice. That's a very good question. This is in regard to the sarcasm study, and I will actually go back to that slide. So the question is asking if we base the context of the sarcastic comments on discrete contextual cues or the comments themselves. In this study, we included discrete contextual cues such as facial expression and intonation, but we systematically faded that across sessions. Here's the graph. So we began with a very exaggerated eye rolling and intonation of voice. So, oh, I love going outside. And systematically faded that throughout the training session so that by the end of the training phase, we were saying it more like, oh, I love going outside. So what it would sound like more in natural conversation. Next question, what did you consider the prerequisite skills for the working memory task? For that question, I would have to refer back to the skills curriculum and the study, but it mainly requires the overt behaviors that are that the child actually emits, are actually saying what the items are that are being presented, whether they're numbers or in the case that I presented, they were categories of items such as pizza or foods or different things you wear. So being able to, for the children to be able to actually label those items is very important, and other language skills that would be required for the task are very important. But in order to answer that question, you could email in at a different time, and I can look into it and answer it for you. The next question, how do you tend to balance attempting to teach the student to perform these skills and giving the student a way to tell others that they respond to those social situations differently? Temple Grandin warns people, I don't generally pick up on sarcasm. Well, there are many people who don't pick up on sarcasm, but to give the child a basic understanding of sarcasm and being able to pick up on some discrete cues in the environment, such as eye rolling or saying the opposite of what is actually going on, or the intonation, is really important in social functioning in general. Oftentimes, people who don't understand sarcasm, we adjust our behavior to talk to them differently, and we don't include a lot of sarcastic comments in our conversation. I'm sure many of you know numerous people who don't respond to sarcasm, and this is very typical. But we think that this behavior is critical to the social development of these kids, specifically for how they respond to these statements. So they don't necessarily have to pick up on every instance of sarcasm, but we want them to have a general understanding that sometimes people say things that they don't really mean. Next question. Do you have recommendations on working with students who cannot remember people's names, but generally have age-appropriate recall? Yes, and this is what we were getting into a little bit with working memory, except that study focused on specific working memory tasks. So giving them some types of behaviors they can engage in, like rehearsal, or categorizing the person in a certain way so that they can remember the name. So if the name was something like a flower, they would say, oh, that person's name sounds like a flower, or just verbal rehearsal. So when they meet the person, they rehearse the person's name. Like the other working memory studies, there were 3 there, and they did teach the children to recall at a higher rate than they were in the actual baseline phase. So even if they had an age-appropriate recall, we didn't necessarily look at that, but we looked at improving it through reinforcement. So just using reinforcement in those working memory studies actually increased responding and recall. So using reinforcement may be a good way, and teaching the child through prompting, so rehearsal. Did you think that a review of didactic relational frames, RFT approach to PT skills, is useful to read into? I do. I have read into relational frame theory a lot for these studies, and I do think that they will provide you with a conceptual analysis that will really help you to define what you're looking at and to identify what behaviors the individual needs to engage in order to respond in a certain way. What resources or workbooks for perspective taking and executive functions do you recommend for behavior analysts to use when programming? Well, as I mentioned, and this is a skills webinar, and all of these studies were based on the skills curriculum. Unlike other curricula out there, the skills curriculum includes cognition and executive function, and all of the skills that an individual needs to learn in their lifetime. So those were great resources for us, but in addition to that, specifically for perspective taking and executive functions, there are resources out there, and I don't have any specifically off the top of my head right now. But if you email in, here I have the email right here. It's info@skillsglobal.com. We can provide you with some more resources. All right, that will be the last question. We'll have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for attending today, and I hope you were able to get a lot out of this. Again, if you have any questions, please email questions to info@skillsglobal.com. Thank you.